glory-seeking. Salk began to lobby the Foundation of Infantile Paralysis for more materials and funds, this time to pursue his idea of developing a vaccine. After initial hesitation, after all, he'd been hired to type the viruses, not to find a cure, the foundation agreed and gave him a large grant. The director of the foundation later said of Salk, "Jonas is in touch with the world. I don't mean that he's worldly. He's not. But he's a human scientist, or call him humane or humanitarian or humanistic. He is aware of the world and concerned about it. He sees beyond the microscope." In 1951, at the age of 37, Jonas Salk set to work full-time to find a solution to one of the greatest medical problems that had ever faced America. For 2 years, Salk grew polio cultures, experimented with ways to kill the virus to make a dead virus vaccine, tried his vaccines out on monkeys, and pored over his results. He worked day and night, and in the few hours that he wasn't working, he was completely distracted. Mrs. Salk liked to tell the story of how one night when she complained he wasn't listening to her, Salk absent-mindedly responded, "My dear, you have my undevoted attention." By 1953, he had come up with a vaccine he thought might just work. Salk had taken the 3 strains of poliovirus and killed them in a formalin solution. Formalin is made from formaldehyde. Then he'd found that even though the virus was dead, as he'd always believed would happen, the body still made antibodies against it. He had tested the virus first on animals, but now he knew he must test it on humans. The obvious first choice for his tests were children who already had polio. They would be safer because they already had antibodies. He did some secret trial vaccinations at one school and one home for crippled children. The parents of these children, who had suffered terribly from their tragedies, were anxious to be of help and to perhaps facilitate a cure. Salk wanted to see if this vaccine would increase the number of antibodies already present in the children's systems. He gave them their injections and returned the next day to take blood samples and to see how they were doing. At the time, he said, "When you inoculate children with a polio vaccine, you don't sleep well for 2 or 3 months." His next experiment was even riskier. He vaccinated children who had no polio antibodies in their blood and waited to see if the vaccine would produce any. The results were outstanding. The children who already had antibodies produced even more, and the children who had none to start with now had antibodies in their blood. Salk called this experience the thrill of my life. But even though the vaccinations increased the antibodies against the disease considerably, he still didn't know if his methods were absolutely safe. He announced his plans for a large testing of the virus on about 25,000 children in spring of 1954. And for the first time, he revealed the experimental inoculations he'd already given children and the promising results. It was right about then that Salk's research triggered one of the most heated and bitter controversies in the history of medicine. On one side of the issue were the scientists like Salk who believed a polio vaccine should be made of killed viruses. On the other side of the argument were scientists who insisted an effective vaccine had to be made from live viruses. That side was led by a professor of pediatrics from Cincinnati named Albert Sabin. Sabin's approach was to use live viruses that had first been modified, attenuated is the scientific term, by repeated passage through animals. With each passage, the virus became less deadly, but still strong enough to cause antibodies to develop. To Sabin, a long-term life immunity could only result from live vaccine. A killed virus like Salk's, he believed, would provide only temporary immunity. Sabin had been developing such a live virus vaccine and believed it would be ready for trial within a few years. Meanwhile, it became his personal cause to block the trial of the Salk vaccine. Salk and Sabin launched a professional and personal war against each other that caught the attention of the scientific community, the press, and the public. Sabin, who was an older man, saw Salk as a publicity-seeking upstart. Salk, on the other hand, found Sabin pompous and condescending. It's true that Salk worked hard to publicize his discovery, but he never received money from the sale of it. When someone asked him who owned the patent, he replied, "The people. Could you patent the sun?" At one point, when the press misled the public into thinking a vaccine had been developed, proved, and would be in use before the next summer, Salk himself went on the radio to explain to the American people that this wasn't the case. He described in clear, non-scientific terms what had been accomplished and what work remained. He stressed the importance of caution, safety, and confidence, but he also gave the public hope. He guaranteed them that the discovery of an effective vaccine was just a matter of time. Never before had the radio audience been addressed directly by a scientist. Salk became famous overnight, and Sabin doubled his efforts to stop him. Rivalry and feuds in the field of science are almost as old as the field itself. For centuries, scientists have involved themselves in fiery debates that often become personal. They competed to make discoveries, to get credit for their discoveries, and to discredit their opponents. There were accusations of sabotage, lying, plagiarism, and deceit that go back to the very beginnings of the profession. Almost always, these competitions, as ugly as they could be, led to new research and discoveries, like the irritation that creates a pearl in the oyster. In the case of the battle of the two scientific giants, Salk and Sabin, there was indeed a pearl, one that saved the lives of thousands. Salk worked harder than ever to perfect his upcoming tests on the vaccine. He took naps instead of going to bed at night, and he ate sandwiches while working at his desk. To prepare for his testing in the general public, Salk first tested his vaccine on himself, then on a few trusting friends and family members. He gave his sons their inoculations while they slept so they wouldn't be frightened. His 3-year-old son, Jonathan, became the youngest person to ever receive a polio vaccination. Asked years later about experimenting on himself, Salk said, "I look at it as ritual and symbolic. You wouldn't do unto others that which you wouldn't do unto yourself." After weeks of bitter debate, the Vaccine Advisory Committee finally voted to proceed with the trial of the Salk vaccine. The date for the first test was set for February 1954, and the place was Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The children receiving it would all be second graders, the group most vulnerable to polio. 5,000 children were inoculated that day, 137 by Dr. Salk himself, who averaged 1 child a minute. There were no problems with the vaccine, although it would be months before its effectiveness could be judged. Encouraged by the results, the government then gave Salk permission for a broad public field test to be held on April 26, 1954. The first public polio vaccinations were an astounding event. American parents were so anxious to protect their children from this terrible disease that over 650,000 children showed up to be inoculated in 44 different states. All were vaccinated, and some were given placebos, a harmless neutral substance that contained no vaccine, so that scientists could make accurate comparisons. It took an army of thousands of volunteers to help administer the vaccine. There were 20,000 doctors, 40,000 nurses, 14,000 school principals, and 200,000 citizens who offered volunteer help. They set up centers for the vaccinations, drove people around, picked up permission slips from parents, and worked with journalists. It seemed as if all America had rallied to work together to end the horrible threat of polio. Then the world sat back and waited for the results. The task of monitoring the results went to Dr. Tom Francis, Salk's old mentor and colleague from Ann Arbor, Michigan. It was an enormous task. In private, he was to review the meticulous results on the injections and evaluate their effectiveness. He was also told to compare the records of children who had not received shots with those who had. Francis was to address himself to 3 critical questions. How many vaccinated children got polio? How many children who were given placebos came down with polio? How many of the children who had no shots at all came down with polio? The evaluation would take 1 year. On April 12, 1955, the 10th anniversary of the death of President Franklin Roosevelt, Dr. Francis was ready to give his report. 500 invited guests waited anxiously for him to begin. Outside, reporters from all over America clamored to get inside and to hear what the results were. When the results were released, they made banner headlines all across the country. Dr. Francis had concluded the vaccine was safe and effective. It was 60 to 70% effective against type 1 paralysis and over 90% effective against types 2 and 3. It was 94% effective against the horrible bulbar form that sentenced victims to the iron lung. Overall, said Francis, Salk's vaccine was 80 to 90% effective against polio. Salk was pleased, but he maintained the vaccine would have been 100% effective had it not been mixed with merthiolate, a germ killer that the National Institute of Health insisted on against his wishes. Instantly, Salk was a national hero. People everywhere now referred to his vaccine as the Salk vaccine, but he himself never called it anything but the poliomyelitis vaccine. The atmosphere across America was celebratory that day. It seemed as if science had finally triumphed in its war against polio. People honked their horns and churches rang their bells. School principals called special assemblies to announce to the students that polio had been conquered. People went to temples and churches to thank God. Salk and his family were deluged with flowers, cards, candy, and gifts, all of which he returned. Hollywood studios called to see if they could get the rights to his life story, which he refused to sell. Babies born that day were named after him, and so were schools and hospitals. The Salk family went to the White House and met the president, where Salk spent all his time talking about the other scientists and researchers who had worked so hard and deserved recognition. Through it all, Salk struggled for his privacy and became more and more sensitive to how negatively other scientists were reacting to the attention he received. He tried to stop the hoopla, but he had little effect. The American public was ecstatic. And then, only 2 weeks later, the triumph turned to despair. The first report came on April 25, 1955. A baby inoculated in Chicago had developed paralytic polio from the vaccine. The next day came the report that 5 children in California were paralyzed from the vaccinations. Over the following days, more and more reports came in until it became apparent that over 200 children had contracted polio from their injections. 3/4 of them were paralyzed, and 11 children died. But all the children had been injected with a vaccine made from the same laboratory, the Cutter Laboratories. 6 companies had produced the vaccine, and not one of them had followed Salk's strict requirements, but only the Cutter vaccine resulted in tragedy. At once, a halt was called to the vaccinations while the Surgeon General launched an investigation. Salk's nemesis, Albert Sabin, leapt at the opportunity to proclaim that the Salk program should be abandoned altogether. Throughout the crisis, Salk never once lost faith in his vaccine. He was close to losing everything he'd worked for, but he believed in his heart that the problem had to be in the Cutter Laboratory and that he would be vindicated. Soon he was proved right. It was discovered that the Cutter Labs had left live viruses in over 50% of their vaccine. A committee of experts that included both Salk and Sabin later voted to restart the program with more stringent inspection of the companies producing the vaccine. Sabin voted against that decision. Salk himself refrained from casting any vote. Once parents realized that the error had come out of the Cutter Laboratories and that the new vaccine was safe, they again brought their children to be inoculated. In the years that followed, hundreds of thousands more children were inoculated, and there were no further cases of polio from the Salk vaccine. As a disease, polio rapidly began to fade. In 1952, there were 58,000 cases of polio. 10 years later, in 1962, there were only 900 cases. Even Salk was surprised at the success of his vaccine. He never dreamed polio would decline so quickly. Dr. Sabin released his own vaccine based on live polio viruses in 1957. Since so many children in America had received the Salk vaccine, he did his testing in Russia, the country where he was born. The test was a success, and the Sabin vaccine became licensed for use in the United States in 1961. Now, the Sabin vaccine is used almost exclusively because it's less expensive and easier to administer than Salk's. Salk's was given by injection. Sabin's is given orally, originally in sugar cubes. Today, polio has virtually disappeared in the Western world, and there is hope that it will soon disappear from the entire planet. After he had proven his polio vaccine, Salk founded the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in San Diego, California. There, scholars from all over the world can pursue their studies in private or in collaboration with other researchers.